Well, I mean, I think that the important thing to ask is how those troops are being used. I think General McChrystal has it right, that in every counterinsurgency doctrine or strategy, the key point is the protection of the local population, because you have to win their hearts and minds, win their support. It's not about force protection. This relieves your ability to use imprecise artillery or air power, which causes collateral damage, which only turns the local population against you. So I think the key has to be to provide protection for the Afghan population, to also provide an enabling environment for development and reconstruction to take place. But the international community as a whole, it's not just about sending more troops. It's about asking for something in return from the Afghan government, and that's to be serious about reforms in the administration, to crack down on corruption. And it's not going to take place overnight.
Is this
but they
group
have
capable
to be
of doing
serious
that?
about it.
Is this group capable of doing that, the Karzai group?
Well, I think that the Karzai group would be susceptible to pressure from the right sources, like President Obama, and if you saw a unified approach from the international community. And so I think maybe even you have to consider having another international conference that has very specific binding commitments for the Afghan government on key issues like governance reforms and corruption.
Steve Staples is already shaking his head. You've given up on this group, right?
I think that they're in all we have before us is a bunch of bad solutions at this point.
So you got to pick the best of the worst.
Exactly.
What's the best of the worst?
Well, I think as we started off this discussion, we went in there to ensure that this place would not be used for international terrorism and Al-Qaeda again. And I think that's pretty much agreed. Most people agreed that has been accomplished. All these other goals are noble, but I'm not sure that we can achieve those, and we can probably have a bigger impact in other parts of the world.
So certainly no surge as far as you're concerned, right? Not a time to double down.
I think that the problem is when you're a military commander, the only tool you have is a hammer, and pretty soon all your problems start looking like nails, when really it needs a completely different approach, and ultimately we have to focus on not better ways to fight the war, but on ways to bring a stable situation and peace to the
Graeme,
place.
what do you say on the issue of General McChrystal's surge?
I mean, I don't even know why we're having this conversation, honestly. I mean, you send in 40,000 more troops, and a lot more people are going to die next fighting season come April and May.
Soldiers or civilians?
If you send in a lot more soldiers, more people will die. If Stanley McChrystal gets his surge, you're going to see deaths all around, insurgents, police, civilians. Those numbers are going to spike. And they're going to spike the following year and the following year.
Well, how would you attempt to pacify the enemy if you don't put more troops in?
Well, how about in 1989 when the Soviets withdrew their foreign forces and they left significant subsidies in place for the Najibullah government? Under that scenario, all kinds of money was still flowing to the central government. They still fought their enemies at the time. The U.S.
What happened to Najibullah?
Well, Najibullah didn't fare so well.
He didn't. He got his head cut off,
hanging for a lamppost. Yeah. But that was after, remember, the Soviet Union collapsed. After the money was cut off. When the money flowed, the Najibullah regime stayed.
Colonel Pellerin, what do you say on the issue of the surge?
Well, I say a retreat is a retreat. What happened after the withdrawal of the Soviet was a civil war in the country, which ended up with the Taliban. And the end result was, Graeme Smith talks about civilians killed. Of course, we decry civilians killed when it does happen. But you compare it to 1 million, probably 1 million civilians were killed in the various periods, the Russian or the Civil War afterwards. We're talking about the latest Red Cross numbers are talking about 1,600. And most of them were killed by the Taliban. So we have to be serious. And also when Stephen Staples talks about the general talking about everything looks like a nail, well, I would suggest that to Stephen that he should read the report, because the report, I think, is very comprehensive, that it isn't just sending troops to kill the Taliban. His first priority is to protect the population, which is a basic tenet of counterinsurgency. So yes, he will need more boots on the ground, and I think he will get them. He might not get 40,000, but the president will not have much of a choice after he sacked his predecessor. He can't very well have his next commander either being sacked or resign.
Right. Stephen, let me get you to comment on this, because if you do read the report, it is pretty clear that General McChrystal places civilian casualties at the top of his priority list. He says every time a civilian dies over there, it is just, I mean, it's 100 steps backward in terms of the efforts for NATO. So you've got a guy who sees that as job one. Does that give you any pause to reconsider your position that we should just declare victory and go home?
No, I think that we need to help foster, if we can, a diplomatic solution to the conflict. There has to be some sort of
Is this a part of the
way.
world where a diplomatic solution is possible?
Well, I don't know what the alternatives are. As I say, there's a bunch of bad agreements. Well, if we keep fighting it out, I think we're going to end up in a situation, as Senator Kenney said, a Vietnam ending, where we're clinging to helicopters off the Canadian embassy at the very end. So I think that this is
okay, I got to let
not
Colonel
going
Pellerin
very well.
The Colonel didn't like that answer. Go ahead, Colonel Pellerin.
He doesn't like Senator Kenney's response,
because Senator Kenney didn't talk about helicopters leaving Afghanistan. Be serious. It's the same with these comparison. It's a quagmire of empires, and the Soviets were defeated, and the Brits were defeated, and therefore will be defeated. I would suggest to people that they should read their history before they draw these conclusions. And it's the same with comparing to Vietnam. It's a completely different situation. I think we should look at the McChrystal report. It's a brilliant report. And John Manley did a brilliant analysis of it, and that's where we should focus instead of false analogies.
Okay, Mercedes, a word?
I think that the McChrystal report does make it very clear that civilians are at the center of the strategy. And one of the questions that we have to ask, because we're always attacking the military here, is that can there be development in the absence of security? Absolutely not. So we have to have the security, we have to have the ability to fight it out and to push back on the enemy to develop these kinds of aid and humanitarian development that we want to see there, because right now you don't have aid groups with an ability to operate. So if you want to see that, well, right now the only people who can do it are the military.
You got to clear and hold.
Absolutely, you have to be able to clear and hold, but it raises the question of where has the diplomacy been here? Where has CETA been in the case of Canada? Where has the Department of Foreign Affairs been? Every time you see a news conference, you see a military commander giving it. Why don't we ever see, we talk about the 3D strategy, where are the other 2Ds every time we have one of these press conferences?
Okay, Mark, come in on that.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't agree that we don't see our diplomats and our aid workers. I mean, obviously, they're not there in the same numbers as our military. They don't have as high a profile role. But Canada has, to use an overused analogy, has punched above its weight in many respects in Afghanistan diplomatically, and is seen as a very good donor. We don't go for the big flagship projects where we throw our flag onto sites, but we actually invest in multi-donor trust funds, which is very much appreciated, and I think gets the most bang for our buck. So I think that there has, in that sense, there has been some progress made. Now, about Afghanistan going forward, it's absolutely true that you need a multi-pronged strategy. You have to engage the Taliban or elements of the Taliban on some level. It's not a monolithic movement, and I think that you could possibly be successful in splitting off some groups from from the Taliban movement itself. And I think you have to focus on building up the Afghan security forces, which is a process that has been a lot slower than expected. But you have to have a security buffer in order to do these things. And that's why it's important that international troops are on the ground and in significant numbers. Let me say one more thing, that I think it's also to remember that NATO didn't deploy across Afghanistan until 2005, 2006. That for the most part, you had in all of southern Afghanistan coalition forces operating separate from the NATO mandate, with only basically a search and destroy mission for Taliban al-Qaeda. They had no mandate to provide an enabling environment for development.
Okay.
This sounds eerily similar to the Biden plan now, and that failed. So I think we have to be careful about moving in that direction.
Jumping in here, less than 6 minutes to go. Stand, forgive me, Colonel, because we got less than 6 minutes to go, and I got to get this on the record here. If all goes according to plan, in less than 2 years, Canada's going to be out of there. And Graeme, I want to start by asking you, do you have any reason to suspect tonight that that timetable will change?